In the quiet hours when sleep beckons and the modern world grows still, there's something deeply soothing about traveling back to a time when the Mediterranean was called our sea by people who believed they had tamed the world. Picture, if you will, the year 55 BCE, when Rome was not yet an empire, but a republic stretching its ambitious fingers across the known world like a sleepy giant awakening to its own power. The story we're about to unfold together is one of those delicious historical mysteries that feel almost too fantastical to be true, yet too well documented to dismiss. It begins in the marble corridors of Rome, where three men held the fate of the civilized world in their hands, and ends. Well, that's rather the point, isn't it? We're not entirely sure where it ends. Some say it concludes in a remote Chinese village where blue-eyed children still play in dusty streets, carrying in their veins the blood of legionaries who vanished into legend. Our tale centers on Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose name has echoed through 20 centuries as both a warning and a wonder. Imagine him, if you can, as a person rather than a historical figure. Crassus was approaching 60, an age when most Romans of his station would be content to tend their gardens and write their memoirs. But Crassus carried within his chest a heart that beat with the rhythm of unfinished business. He was the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest man in the world. His wealth had been built on a foundation that might make us wince today. He owned a private fire brigade that would negotiate prices while buildings burned, and he had made fortunes from the confiscated properties of those who had fallen afoul of Sulla's purges. Yet money, that most tangible of achievements, had brought him neither the military glory that Caesar was winning in Gaul, nor the oratorical brilliance that made Pompey beloved by the masses. Picture Crassus in his villa overlooking the Forum, watching the sun set over a city that whispered his name with respect, but not with love. The Romans adored wealth, certainly, but they worshipped military victory. And at nearly 60, with his hair gone white and his hands more accustomed to counting coins than gripping a sword, Crassus faced the possibility that he might be remembered merely as the financier of greater men's dreams. This is where our story takes its first curious turn, one that would have consequences rippling across continents and centuries. In the complex dance of Roman politics, Crassus found himself bound in an alliance with his two greatest rivals. The first triumvirate, as history would call it, was in secret agreement between Crassus, Pompey Magnus, and Julius Caesar. Think of it as a gentleman's club where the membership fee was measured in legions, and the house rules were written in the blood of enemies. The arrangement was elegantly simple and breathtakingly dangerous. Each man would receive a province to govern, a stage upon which to perform their particular talents. Caesar had chosen Gaul, that wild land beyond the Alps where fortune and glory could be won with equal measures of brilliance and brutality. Pompey had taken Spain, a wealthy province that would provide him with both resources and the opportunity to burnish his reputation as Rome's greatest general. And Crassus? Crassus chose Syria. Now, Syria in the 1st century BCE was not the troubled land we know today, but neither was it the prize that Gaul or Spain represented. It was wealthy, certainly, with trade routes that carried silk and spices from the mysterious East. But it was also a frontier province, bordered by the vast and largely unknown Parthian Empire. The Parthians were Rome's great rivals in the East, descendants of the warriors who had once served Alexander the Great, but who had long since carved out their own destiny in the lands between the Tigris and the distant mountains of India. From his comfortable position as the third man in Rome's triumvirate, Syria might have seemed like a reasonable choice to Crassus. It was wealthy enough to fund his political ambitions and distant enough from Rome to allow him the independence he needed to build his military reputation. But there was something else that drew him eastward, something that whispered to him in the quiet moments between sleep and waking. Gold. Not the metaphorical gold of glory, though that too called to him, but actual, tangible, glittering gold. The Parthians controlled trade routes that brought the wealth of India and distant China westward. Their king lived in splendor that made even Roman luxury seem modest by comparison. And Crassus, despite already being the richest man in the Western world, found himself dreaming of the treasures that lay beyond the eastern horizon. At this point, let me pause to welcome you to our little corner of the night, where history becomes a gentle companion to your dreams. I'm your host on this midnight voyage through time, and if you're finding comfort in these ancient stories, please let us know with a like and subscription. It helps us continue crafting these bedtime journeys through the past. Tonight's tale has many more curious twists ahead, including a mystery that would puzzle archaeologists for 2,000 years and perhaps, just perhaps, give us Romans living still in the mountains of China. The more Crassus contemplated his Syrian opportunity, the more his imagination was captured by possibilities that sparkled like stars in a clear desert sky. He began to dream not just of wealth, but of conquest that would eclipse even Caesar's victories in Gaul. Why stop at Syria when the entire Parthian Empire lay beyond, ripe for the taking? Why settle for governing a single province when he could return to Rome as the conqueror of the East, the man who had brought the treasures of kings to kneel before the Roman people? It's easy, from our comfortable distance of 20 centuries, to see the hubris in such thinking. But try to understand Crassus as he understood himself. He lived in an age when the impossible seemed to happen with delightful regularity. Caesar was conquering lands whose names Roman children couldn't pronounce. Pompey had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and brought kings in chains to march in his triumph. Why shouldn't a man of Crassus's wealth and political acumen claim his own share of glory? The decision, once made, consumed him with the intensity of a fever. Crassus began assembling what would become one of the largest armies Rome had ever sent beyond its borders. 7 legions, each consisting of roughly 6,000 to 7,000 men, would march under his eagles. 4,000 cavalry would ride alongside them, their horses' hooves drumming the rhythm of ambition across the dusty roads of Asia. 4,000 more light infantry would scout ahead and protect the flanks, men whose job it was to be the eyes and ears of the great machine of conquest. Nearly 4,000 horsemen and as many light-armed troops would accompany the 7 legions that Crassus assembled for his eastern adventure. When you pause to consider these numbers, you begin to understand the magnitude of what he was attempting. This was not a raid or a punitive expedition, but a full-scale invasion designed to bring an entire civilization to its knees. But numbers, even impressive ones, tell only part of our story. To truly understand what happened in the desert sands near a place called Carrhae, we must first understand the men who would fight there. A Roman legion was not simply a collection of soldiers. It was a complex organism, a small mobile city with its own culture, traditions, and unshakable sense of superiority. Picture a legionary, if you will, not as the Hollywood version with gleaming armor and perfect formation, but as he actually was, a man from the hills of Italy or the growing towns of Roman Gaul, someone who had signed up for 25 years of service in exchange for citizenship and a plot of land upon retirement. He carried on his back not just his weapons and armor, but everything he needed to survive in hostile territory. Tools for digging fortifications, cooking gear, spare clothing, personal possessions that connected him to a home he might not see for years. These men had learned to trust in their system above all else. Roman military doctrine was built on the principle that disciplined soldiers, properly organized and led, could overcome any enemy through the application of relentless, with methodical pressure. They had proven this theory from the forests of Germany to the hills of Spain. Their tactics were not flashy or innovative, but they were devastatingly effective. The Roman way of war was like a slow-moving but inexorable tide. They would march into enemy territory, build fortified camps each night that were marvels of engineering, and gradually squeeze their opponents until resistance became impossible. They fought in formations that had been tested across centuries, where each man knew his place and his duty. When Roman soldiers advanced with their shields locked together and their javelins ready, they resembled nothing so much as a great moving wall, impersonal and implacable. This system had worked everywhere Rome had tried it. Against the fierce but disorganized Gallic tribes, against the sophisticated but internally divided Greek cities, against the numerous but poorly equipped Germanic warriors. The legions had become accustomed to victory not through individual brilliance, but through collective superiority. They were, in their own minds, and in the minds of their enemies, irresistible. Crassus, despite his lack of significant military experience, had every reason to share this confidence. He had watched the legions work their methodical magic in suppressing Spartacus's rebellion, had seen how Roman discipline could break even the most desperate courage. The Parthians, whatever their reputation as horsemen, were merely another enemy to be ground down by the millstone of Roman military efficiency. Yet as Crassus's great army prepared to march eastward from Syria, there were whispers of concern from those who understood the nature of their destination. Syria was Roman territory, with Roman roads and Roman supply lines. Beyond its eastern borders lay a different world entirely, one where the rules that governed warfare in the Mediterranean might not apply. The Parthian Empire was built on foundations entirely different from those that supported Roman power. Where Rome conquered through disciplined infantry and systematic siege warfare, Parthia controlled its vast territories through mobility and the devastating effectiveness of mounted archers. Their armies were built around horses in ways that Romans, despite their cavalry auxiliaries, could barely comprehend. A Parthian nobleman learned to ride before he could properly walk, and his relationship with his horse was as intimate as a Roman's relationship with his shield and sword. These were not simply men who happened to fight on horseback, but warriors for whom the horse was an extension of their own bodies. They could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, could wheel and maneuver in patterns that seemed almost like dance, could appear and disappear across the landscape like desert mirages. More importantly, they understood the land where Crassus was determined to fight. The plains of Mesopotamia were their natural element, vast expanses where mobility mattered more than formation, where water sources were precious and known only to local guides, where an army that moved slowly could find itself surrounded and cut off from supplies with terrifying speed. But these concerns, when they were raised at all, seemed distant and theoretical compared to the concrete reality of Roman military superiority. After all, what horse archer could stand against the methodical advance of a Roman legion? What mobility could matter when faced with Roman engineering and Roman discipline? Crassus and his officers looked at their maps, calculated their supply requirements, and prepared to extend Roman civilization into yet another corner of the world. The preparations took on the character of a great festival. Wealthy Romans competed to contribute to the expedition, seeing in Crassus's adventure an opportunity to share in the glory and profit that would surely follow. Equipment was commissioned from the finest armorers and weaponsmiths. Ships were chartered to carry supplies eastward across the Mediterranean. The entire enterprise took on the air of a grand commercial venture as much as a military campaign. As spring turned towards summer in the year 54 BCE, Crassus's great army began its march eastward from Rome. The roads rang with the sound of hobnailed sandals on stone, the creak of wagon wheels, the rhythmic chanting that Roman soldiers used to maintain their pace on long marches. Citizens lined the routes to watch the legions pass, marveling at the sight of so much Roman power concentrated in a single host. Yet even as the crowds cheered and the standards glittered in the Italian sunshine, there were those who watched with uneasiness rather than pride. Some whispered that the omens had been unfavorable, that the priests had read troubling signs in the flight of birds and the examination of sacrificial animals. Others noted that Crassus, despite his wealth and political acumen, had never commanded an army of this size in hostile territory. But such concerns were lost in the general excitement of the moment. Rome was extending its reach eastward, as it had extended westward into Gaul and southward into Africa. The legions were marching to add another province to the growing catalogue of Roman conquests. What could possibly go wrong? As summer deepened and the army crossed into Syria, Crassus found himself governing a province that was everything he had hoped and more. The cities of Syria were wealthy and cosmopolitan, their markets filled with goods from across the known world. The local population, while not Roman, was civilized and generally compliant. Tax revenues flowed into Crassus's treasury with satisfying regularity. Yet even as he enjoyed the fruits of provincial command, Crassus's eyes remained fixed on the eastern horizon. Beyond the Syrian desert lay the Parthian Empire, its cities heavy with the accumulated wealth of centuries, its rulers adorned with jewels and gold that made Roman luxury seem austere by comparison. The more he learned about Parthian wealth, the more his appetite for conquest grew. The intelligence that reached Crassus from across the border was encouraging. The Parthian Empire was vast but thinly populated, its armies scattered across enormous distances. The current king, Oroda II, was occupied with internal disputes and seemed unprepared for a major Roman invasion. Local conditions appeared favorable for a lightning campaign that could strike deep into Parthian territory before effective resistance could be organized. As the year 54 BCE drew toward its close, Crassus began making concrete plans for invasion. He would march in the spring of 53, when the winter rains had passed, but the summer heat had not yet made movement unbearable. His 7 legions would advance along multiple routes, converging on the Parthian heartland before the enemy could coordinate an effective response. It would be swift, decisive, and profitable beyond imagining. The more detailed his planning became, the more real his dreams of conquest seemed. Crassus could already see himself returning to Rome in triumph, his baggage trains heavy with Parthian gold, his prisoners including kings and princes of the East. He would build monuments to commemorate his victories, endow temples to celebrate his successes, and take his place alongside Pompey and Caesar as one of Rome's greatest conquerors. Winter passed quietly in Syria, with Crassus using the months of enforced inactivity to drill his troops and accumulate supplies. His agents moved discreetly through the border regions, gathering intelligence about Parthian troop movements and identifying potential allies among the various tribes and city-states that owed nominal allegiance to Oroda. As spring approached, the great adventure began to take its final shape. Soon, the Roman eagles would cross the invisible line that separated civilization from barbarism, order from chaos, Roman destiny from foreign obscurity. Soon, Crassus would discover whether his dreams of Eastern conquest were prophetic visions or merely the fantasies of an aging man who had confused wealth with wisdom, confidence with competence. But those discoveries lay ahead, beyond the desert horizon, where mysterious enemies waited with patience that had been honed across centuries of warfare. For now, in the comfortable certainty of his Syrian headquarters, Crassus could still believe that Roman discipline and determination would prove sufficient for whatever challenges awaited in the east. Spring arrived in Syria with the gentle persistence of hope itself, bringing with it the kind of perfect campaign weather that seemed to smile upon Roman ambitions. The rains had ended, leaving the desert roads firm, but not yet burning under the merciless summer sun. In his headquarters at Antioch, Crassus watched the final preparations unfold with the satisfaction of a man who had planned meticulously and was now ready to reap the rewards of his foresight. The sight of 7 legions preparing for march was something that never failed to stir the Roman heart. Even the most experienced observers found themselves moved by the spectacle of so much organized military power. Each morning brought the sound of trumpets calling the men to their duties, the rhythmic clank of armor being adjusted and weapons being checked. The low murmur of 40,000 voices engaged in the 1,000 small tasks that made a great army function. Yet as impressive as the legions appeared in their Syrian camps, they were about to enter a world where their familiar advantages might count for less than their commanders imagined. The intelligence reports that reached Crassus spoke of Parthian forces gathering somewhere beyond the horizon, but the details remained frustratingly vague. How many enemies awaited him? What was their disposition? Where would they choose to make their stand? These uncertainties might have given a more experienced general pause, but Crassus found himself energized rather than concerned by the unknown challenges ahead. After all, uncertainty was simply another word for opportunity. The Parthians' secretiveness might just as easily indicate weakness as strength. Perhaps they were as confused and unprepared as his intelligence suggested. As the final weeks of preparation passed, Crassus received a visitor whose arrival would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined at the time. Abgarus, king of Osroene, presented himself at the Roman camp with all the ceremony befitting a client king seeking to curry favor with his powerful neighbors. His kingdom lay strategically positioned between Roman Syria and the Parthian heartland, making his friendship valuable to either side. Abgarus was everything a Roman might expect from an Eastern potentate. Elegantly dressed, smoothly diplomatic, and apparently eager to accommodate Roman interests. He spoke eloquently of his desire to see Roman civilization extended eastward, of his admiration for Roman military prowess, and of his intimate knowledge of the terrain that lay ahead. Most importantly, he offered to serve as guide for Crassus's invasion, providing local knowledge that could mean the difference between success and failure. To Crassus, Abgarus's arrival seemed like a gift from the gods themselves. Here was a solution to one of his most pressing concerns: how to navigate unfamiliar territory while maintaining the speed necessary for a successful campaign. With a knowledgeable local ruler as guide, the Roman army could move confidently toward its objectives, avoiding the delays and confusion that might otherwise allow the Parthians time to organize effective resistance. The agreement was reached with the kind of mutual satisfaction that often precedes the most spectacular disasters. Abgarus would provide guides and intelligence in exchange for Roman recognition of his expanded territorial claims once the Parthian Empire had been defeated. It seemed like an eminently reasonable arrangement, the sort of practical diplomacy that had served Rome well in countless previous campaigns. What Crassus could not know, what his experience and assumptions prevented him from even suspecting, was that Abgarus had already made a rather different arrangement with the Parthian court. The elegant king who spoke so persuasively of Roman friendship had, in fact, agreed to serve as the instrument of Roman destruction. His guides would lead the legions not toward victory, but toward the most carefully prepared trap in the history of ancient warfare. As May arrived and the campaign season opened in earnest, Crassus gave the order for the great advance to begin. The sight of 7 legions, moving in coordinated formation across the Syrian landscape, was magnificent in its implications. Here was Roman power made manifest, the accumulated military wisdom of centuries organized into an instrument of seemingly irresistible force. The army moved with the methodical precision that had become the hallmark of Roman military operations. Each day began before dawn with the complex ritual of breaking camp, a process so well rehearsed that 40,000 men could transform a temporary city into a marching column in less than 2 hours. The baggage trains were loaded according to strict procedures. The cavalry took their assigned positions on the flanks, and the legions themselves formed up in the fighting order that had proven successful from Britain to Egypt. For the first several days, everything proceeded exactly as Crassus had planned. The weather remained favorable, the terrain offered no unusual obstacles, and the army made excellent progress toward the Euphrates River, which would mark their passage from Roman territory into the contested borderlands where their real adventure would begin. Yet even during these early days of apparently smooth progress, there were subtle signs that all was not quite as it seemed. Abgarus's guides, while knowledgeable and apparently helpful, had a tendency to recommend routes that seemed unnecessarily circuitous. When Roman officers questioned these recommendations, the explanations were always reasonable: avoiding difficult terrain, finding better water sources, staying clear of areas where bandits might pose a threat. More troubling, though few Romans were experienced enough to recognize the significance, was the curious absence of local intelligence about Parthian military movements. In previous campaigns, Roman armies had been able to gather detailed information about enemy dispositions through a network of merchants, travelers, and local informants. But as they moved deeper into the borderlands, such information became mysteriously scarce. It was as if an entire region had suddenly fallen silent, as if the normal traffic of communication and commerce had been suspended by some invisible authority. Merchants who should have been crossing the frontier in both directions were nowhere to be found. Travelers and messengers seemed to have vanished from the roads. Even the birds, some of the more superstitious soldiers noted, seemed to avoid the skies ahead of the advancing Roman columns. But these concerns, when they were voiced at all, seemed minor compared to the magnificent spectacle of Roman military efficiency in action. Each evening, the army would halt and immediately begin construction of a fortified camp that represented a marvel of organization and engineering. Within hours, what had been empty landscape would be transformed into a perfectly planned military city, complete with streets, designated areas for each unit, and defensive works that could have withstood a siege. The routine was hypnotically reassuring in its perfection. Guards were posted according to procedures that had been refined over centuries. Meals were prepared and distributed with clockwork precision. Equipment was cleaned and maintained according to schedules that ensured nothing was ever left to chance. Everything functioned exactly as it was supposed to function, creating an atmosphere of competence and control that made the unknown challenges ahead seem manageable. Crassus himself moved through this well-ordered world with growing confidence. Each day's march brought him closer to his destiny, and each night's successful encampment proved once again that Roman methods were equal to any challenge. His staff officers reported regularly on the army's excellent condition, the high morale of the troops, and the continued cooperation of their local allies. As the army approached the Euphrates, Crassus made a decision that would later be analyzed and debated by military historians for centuries. Rather than crossing the river at one of the established ford points where Roman forces might expect to find infrastructure and supplies, he accepted Abgarus's recommendation to use a more northerly crossing that would, the king assured him, provide tactical advantages for the advance into Mesopotamia. The crossing itself was accomplished with the sort of technical excellence that had made Roman engineering legendary. Pontoon bridges were constructed with materials carried in the baggage trains. Ferries were organized to transport cavalry and equipment, and the entire operation was completed ahead of schedule despite the river's considerable width and current. As the last elements of the army reached the eastern bank, Crassus could look back with satisfaction at another demonstration of Roman superiority over natural obstacles. But crossing the Euphrates meant more than simply moving from one piece of geography to another. It meant leaving behind the last vestiges of familiar territory and entering a world where different rules applied, where the comfortable assumptions of Mediterranean warfare might prove inadequate to the challenges ahead. The landscape beyond the river was subtly but significantly different from anything the Romans had encountered in their previous conquests. The terrain was not simply desert, as some accounts would later claim, but a complex mixture of arid plains, scattered hills, and seasonal watercourses that could transform from dusty ravines to raging torrents, depending on weather conditions hundreds of miles away. More importantly, this was country that favored the type of warfare at which the Parthians excelled. The open spaces provided unlimited room for maneuver, while the irregular terrain offered countless opportunities for ambush and surprise. Water sources were scattered and often difficult to locate, making supply lines vulnerable to interdiction. Most critically, there were few natural defensive positions where a slower-moving army could take shelter if threatened by more mobile enemies. Yet these disadvantages were not immediately apparent to Roman eyes accustomed to judging terrain from the perspective of disciplined infantry operations. To Crassus and his officers, the country ahead looked challenging but not impossible, difficult but not unsurmountable. They had dealt with hostile terrain before, and had invariably found ways to turn natural obstacles to their advantage through superior organization and engineering skill. As the army began its advance into Mesopotamia proper, Abgarus continued to provide guidance that seemed both helpful and strategically sound. His recommendations for routes and camping sites showed intimate knowledge of local conditions, and his ability to communicate with various tribal groups they encountered suggested the sort of political connections that could prove invaluable as the campaign developed. What the Romans could not see was the subtle but systematic way in which their movements were being channeled toward a destination of their enemy's choosing. Each day's march, while apparently following the most logical route toward Parthian population centers, was actually bringing them closer to a carefully prepared killing ground where every advantage would belong to their opponents. The Parthian response to the Roman invasion was developing with the sort of patient precision that characterized their entire approach to warfare. Rather than rushing to meet the invaders with hasty counterattacks, they were allowing the Romans to advance deeper into territory where mobility would matter more than discipline, where local knowledge would count for more than tactical training, where the accumulated advantages of centuries of Roman military development might prove insufficient to overcome the specific challenges of desert warfare. Surina, the young Parthian general who had been chosen to deal with the Roman threat, was orchestrating a campaign of deception and misdirection that would have impressed the most sophisticated military theorists. By remaining invisible while the Romans advanced, he was creating in their minds a false sense of security, an assumption that Parthian resistance would be minimal and poorly organized. Meanwhile, his actual forces were gathering in the desert like a storm that builds beyond the horizon, invisible until the moment it strikes. Thousands of mounted archers were converging on predetermined positions, their movements coordinated through a communication system that made use of signal fires, messenger relays, and the sort of intimate knowledge of local conditions that no foreign invader could hope to match. The trap was being prepared with a sophistication that reflected centuries of experience in dealing with armies that depended on discipline and organization rather than mobility and adaptation. Every element was being positioned to maximize the effectiveness of Parthian strengths while exploiting the specific weaknesses that Surinna had identified in Roman tactical doctrine. But as Crassus's army continued its apparently successful advance, such concerns seemed distant and theoretical. The legions were making excellent progress, maintaining their formation and discipline, and showing every sign of being ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The Roman system was working exactly as it was designed to work, creating a confidence that would prove tragically misplaced when the moment of truth finally arrived. The days passed in a rhythm of march and camp, advance and consolidation, that had become second nature to the Roman military machine. Each morning brought them closer to their objective, and each evening found them safely established in fortified positions that seemed to guarantee their security. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and that fact alone should have been enough to make any experienced general deeply suspicious. As they moved deeper into the Mesopotamian landscape, the very success of their advance was blinding them to the subtle signs that their enemies were not absent, but merely waiting. The real battle for the soul of the Eastern world was about to begin, and neither side yet understood the full implications of what was about to unfold in the desert sands near an obscure town called Carrhae. The morning of what would become known as the Battle of Carrhae dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that desert dwellers know often precedes the most dramatic weather. May 6th, 53 BCE, began like so many other days of the campaign. Roman trumpets calling the legions to wakefulness, the familiar sounds of camp being broken down with methodical efficiency, and the quiet confidence of men who had grown accustomed to their own invincibility. Crassus stood outside his command tent as the sun climbed above the eastern horizon, watching his great army transform itself from a sleeping city into a moving instrument of conquest. At nearly 60 years old, he possessed the kind of dignified bearing that Romans associated with authority. But this morning there was something else in his posture, an anticipation that spoke of dreams about to be fulfilled, of destiny finally within reach. The intelligence reports from the previous evening had been encouraging, if somewhat puzzling. Abgarus and his scouts had reported signs of Parthian military activity somewhere ahead, but the enemy forces appeared to be relatively small and possibly in retreat. This news had been received with satisfaction by the Roman command staff, who interpreted it as evidence that their invasion was proceeding more successfully than even their most optimistic predictions had suggested. What they could not know was that Surinna, the brilliant young Parthian general who had been given the seemingly impossible task of stopping a Roman invasion, had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Every piece of intelligence that reached the Romans had been carefully crafted to create a specific impression. Every visible sign of Parthian activity had been designed to support the illusion that their enemies were unprepared and disorganized. The reality was quite different. Hidden in the desert landscape that seemed so empty to Roman eyes, nearly 10,000 Parthian warriors waited with the patience of hunters who know their prey is approaching the perfect moment for the strike. These were not the sort of soldiers that Romans had faced in their Mediterranean campaigns. Disciplined infantry who would stand in formation and trade blows until superior Roman organization could prevail. Instead, Surinna had assembled a force that represented the pinnacle of Parthian military art. 1,000 heavily armored cavalry called cataphracts, mounted on massive horses and armed with lances that could punch through the finest Roman armor, supported by 9,000 horse archers whose mobility and accuracy had been honed through generations of steppe warfare. This was an army built around movement and missile fire, designed to strike and withdraw, to appear and vanish like a desert mirage. The Parthian battle plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Rather than meeting the Romans in the kind of direct confrontation that had served their enemies so well in previous campaigns, Surinna intended to use the vast open spaces of the Mesopotamian plain to negate every advantage that Roman tactical doctrine provided. The horse archers would attack in waves, loosing their arrows from distances that made Roman javelins useless, then wheeling away before the legions could close to fighting range. Meanwhile, the cataphracts would wait for the perfect moment to charge, their massive horses and heavy lances designed to shatter any formation that had been weakened by the constant rain of missiles. But perhaps most importantly, Surinna had solved the one problem that had historically limited the effectiveness of horse archers in prolonged combat: ammunition supply. A train of camels loaded with arrows followed his army, ensuring that his bowmen could maintain their fire for as long as necessary to achieve complete victory. The Romans were about to face an enemy who could literally shoot at them all day without running short of projectiles. As the Roman army began its advance on that fateful morning, the landscape ahead appeared peaceful and largely empty. The terrain was ideal for the kind of methodical advance that had served the legions so well in countless previous battles. Gently rolling plain that allowed for proper formation keeping, good visibility that would prevent surprise attacks, and firm ground that would support the weight of heavily equipped infantry. Yet this apparently favorable battlefield was actually the heart of Surinna's trap. The open ground that looked so suitable for Roman tactics would prove perfect for Parthian mobility. The good visibility that should have prevented ambushes would instead allow the enemy to coordinate their attacks with devastating precision. Most importantly, the firm terrain that supported marching infantry would also provide ideal footing for cavalry operations. Crassus rode near the head of his army, accompanied by his son Publius, a young man whose presence represented both his father's pride and his most vulnerable point. Publius commanded a mixed force of cavalry and Gallic horsemen that Caesar had lent to the expedition, and his energy and enthusiasm had been a source of encouragement throughout the long march from Syria. The relationship between father and son was one of those touching details that make ancient history feel suddenly personal and immediate. Crassus, despite his wealth and political success, had never quite managed to achieve the kind of military glory that Roman society valued above all other accomplishments. In Publius, he saw not only his heir, but his partner in the great adventure that would finally establish their family's place among Rome's greatest military dynasties. As the morning progressed and the army maintained its steady advance, Roman confidence continued to build. The legions moved in perfect formation, their standards glittering in the desert sun, their discipline and organization creating an impression of irresistible power. Veterans of countless campaigns marched alongside newer recruits, all united in the conviction that Roman military superiority would prove decisive regardless of whatever challenges lay ahead. It was shortly before midday when the first signs appeared that this would not be an ordinary day of marching. Dust clouds became visible on the horizon, suggesting the movement of large bodies of cavalry somewhere ahead. Roman officers studied these distant signs through the shimmering heat waves, trying to determine whether they indicated enemy activity or simply the movement of friendly forces under Abgarus's command. The truth became apparent with shocking suddenness. What had appeared to be distant dust clouds resolved themselves into organized formations of mounted warriors, and those formations were moving not away from the Roman army, but directly toward it. The enemy had not retreated, had not been caught unprepared, had not obligingly positioned themselves for defeat by superior Roman tactics. Instead, they had been waiting. The Parthian attack began with a sound that Roman veterans would remember for the rest of their lives. The deep, thunderous beating of war drums that seemed to make the very ground tremble beneath their feet. These were not the familiar signals of Mediterranean warfare, but something entirely alien and profoundly threatening. A rhythm that spoke of vast open spaces and warriors who had learned their trade in the endless conflicts of the eastern steppes. Then came the horns, great curved instruments that produced notes so deep and resonant they seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to something primitive and fearful in the human heart. The sound rolled across the desert like thunder, amplified by the acoustic properties of the landscape until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. But the most unnerving aspect of the Parthian approach was its apparent contradiction of everything Romans understood about cavalry tactics. Instead of charging directly at the enemy lines, the sort of frontal assault that Roman infantry had been trained to meet and defeat, the Parthian horsemen spread out across the horizon like a breaking wave, their movements flowing and coordinated in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Crassus, despite his limited combat experience, recognized the critical nature of the moment and immediately began deploying his forces according to standard Roman doctrine. The legions formed up in the testudo, or tortoise formation, with shields locked together to create a mobile fortress that should have been impervious to missile fire. The cavalry took position on the flanks, ready to counter any attempt at encirclement. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the tactical manual. Yet even as the Roman formations took shape with their customary precision, experienced officers began to notice details that didn't match their expectations of barbarian warfare. The Parthian cavalry moved with a discipline and coordination that suggested extensive training and professional leadership. Their equipment, visible now at closer range, was clearly of the highest quality, not the improvised gear of tribal warriors, but the product of sophisticated metallurgy and craftsmanship. Most disturbing of all was the sheer scale of the enemy force. What Roman intelligence had suggested would be a modest force of local irregulars was revealing itself to be a substantial army, well equipped and superbly organized. The comfortable assumptions that had guided Roman planning throughout the campaign were crumbling with each passing moment. The first exchange of missiles began at a range that surprised the Romans with its effectiveness. Parthian arrows, shot from composite bows that had been perfected over centuries of steppe warfare, could reach targets far beyond the distance at which Roman javelins could be effectively employed. This meant that the enemy could inflict casualties while remaining essentially immune to retaliation, a situation that Roman tactical doctrine had never seriously contemplated. The arrows themselves were unlike anything the Romans had encountered in their Mediterranean campaigns, where their previous enemies had relied primarily on iron arrowheads designed to penetrate armor through brute force. The Parthians employed a variety of specialized points tailored to specific tactical purposes. Some were designed to punch through mail and scale armor, others to cause maximum tissue damage to unprotected areas, still others to penetrate shields and disable the men behind them. But most psychologically devastating were the arrows with golden points that gave the battle its lasting name in Persian memory. These were not simply expensive demonstrations of Parthian wealth, but carefully crafted projectiles that caught and reflected the desert sunlight, creating a glittering storm of death that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Roman soldiers, accustomed to the grim businesslike character of Mediterranean warfare, found themselves facing an enemy who had turned killing into a form of deadly art. The Roman response to this unprecedented situation was characteristically methodical and, under the circumstances, entirely inadequate. The testudo formation that should have provided protection against normal archery proved clumsy and vulnerable when subjected to the sustained, accurate fire that the Parthians were able to maintain. Arrows found gaps between shields, penetrated overlapping joints, and gradually degraded the formation's effectiveness through cumulative damage. More critically, the Roman tactical system was built around the assumption that missile exchanges would be brief preliminaries to hand-to-hand combat, where superior Roman training and equipment would prove decisive. But the Parthians showed no inclination to close-to-fighting range, instead maintaining their devastating archery fire while dancing beyond the reach of Roman weapons. As the morning wore on and Parthian arrows continued to find their marks with mechanical regularity, Roman casualties began to mount in ways that challenged everything the legions understood about battlefield dynamics. Men were dying without having had the opportunity to strike back, wounded without being able to close with their tormentors, demoralized by an enemy who remained perpetually just beyond reach. The psychological impact of this one-sided exchange was perhaps even more significant than the physical casualties. Roman soldiers had been trained to believe that their discipline and courage would always provide opportunities to influence the outcome of battle through their own actions. But against an enemy who refused to engage in the kind of combat where Roman advantages could be brought to bear, individual courage seemed suddenly irrelevant. Crassus, watching his carefully planned invasion dissolve into a nightmare of frustrated impotence, made the decision that would seal his army's fate and create one of history's most enduring mysteries. Rather than attempting to withdraw to a more defensible position or trying to find terrain that would negate Parthian mobility, he decided to divide his forces and send his son Publius with the cavalry and Gallic horsemen in a flanking attack designed to disrupt the enemy's archery. The decision was tactically understandable and strategically disastrous. By dividing his forces in the face of a superior enemy, Crassus was violating one of the most basic principles of military science. But more than that, he was sending his son and his most mobile troops away from the main body at precisely the moment when concentration of force had become essential for survival. Publius accepted his mission with the kind of eager enthusiasm that made his father simultaneously proud and terrified. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate the family's military prowess, to strike a decisive blow that would turn the tide of battle and justify all their hopes for Eastern conquest. As he led his mixed force of Roman and Gallic cavalry away from the main body, Publius embodied all the courage and ambition that had brought the Romans so far from their Mediterranean homeland. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical deception that demonstrated the full sophistication of Parthian military art. As Publius's cavalry charged toward what appeared to be a vulnerable section of the enemy line, the Parthians executed a feigned retreat that drew the Romans away from any possible support. The maneuver looked like success to Roman eyes, but it was actually the final stage of an elaborate trap. Once Publius's force was isolated and committed to pursuit, the retreating Parthians suddenly wheeled and surrounded them with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and professional leadership. The young Roman commander found himself and his men cut off from the main army, outnumbered, and facing enemies who had maneuvered them into a position where every Parthian advantage could be brought to bear. The destruction of Publius's force was swift and complete, a demonstration of what happened when Roman cavalry tried to fight Parthian horsemen on terms that favored mobility over discipline. But the personal tragedy was even greater than the tactical disaster, for among the dead was Marcus Crassus's beloved son. the young man who had represented all his father's hopes for military glory and dynastic continuation. When news of his son's death reached Crassus, the old man's reaction was visible to every soldier in the army. The confident commander who had led them across the Euphrates with such high hopes seemed to age decades in the space of moments. His shoulders sagged as if the weight of command had suddenly become unbearable, and his eyes took on the distant look of someone whose world has been fundamentally altered by loss. This seems like a natural place to pause in our nighttime journey and remind you that you're listening to our channel dedicated to these gentle explorations of history's mysteries. If you're finding comfort in these ancient stories as you settle towards sleep, a like and subscription helps us continue creating these bedtime journeys through time. We still have much to discover about what happened to those thousands of Roman soldiers who survived this terrible day, including a mystery that would intrigue archaeologists for 20 centuries to come. The personal dimension of Crassus's grief was devastating, but its impact on the army's morale was catastrophic. Roman soldiers had been trained to follow leaders who projected confidence and competence, but the man they now saw was broken by loss and uncertain of his next move. The psychological foundation of Roman military success, the unwavering belief that their system and their leaders were superior to any enemy, was crumbling as visibly as the physical formations under Parthian arrow fire. Yet even in this moment of supreme crisis, some spark of the old Roman determination flickered to life. Veterans who had served in a dozen campaigns began to rally around their standards, not because they believed victory was still possible, but because the alternative to continued resistance was surrender to enemies who had already demonstrated their ruthlessness. If they were going to die, they would die as Romans. The remainder of that terrible day became a test of endurance that pushed human courage to its absolute limits. The Parthians, having eliminated the threat posed by Publius's cavalry, returned their full attention to the main Roman force, resuming their devastating archery with renewed intensity. Arrow after arrow found its mark, each casualty further weakening formations that had once seemed unbreakable. The sun climbed toward its zenith, and still the golden storm continued. Roman shields bristled with arrows like the quills of some monstrous porcupine. Men collapsed from wounds, from exhaustion, from the sheer psychological strain of facing death, without being able to strike back. The orderly formations that had marked the beginning of the day dissolved into desperate clusters of survivors, each group trying to protect itself against enemies who seemed to be everywhere at once. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the Roman situation had become hopeless by any rational measure. Casualties mounted steadily, while ammunition dwindled and water supplies ran low. The army that had crossed the Euphrates with such confidence was dying by degrees under the merciless Mesopotamian sun, its strength bleeding away with each flight of Parthian arrows. Yet it was precisely at this moment of apparent defeat that the most mysterious chapter of our story began to unfold. For while the chronicles tell us that Marcus Crassus and many thousands of his soldiers died in the desert near Carrhae, they also speak of survivors, men who somehow escaped the slaughter and vanished into the vast expanses of the Eastern world. Some accounts suggest that as many as 10,000 Roman soldiers may have survived the battle itself, either by fighting their way clear of the immediate disaster, or by surrendering to enemies who saw profit in preserving their lives. These men, if they existed, would have faced a choice that was both simple and terrible: death in the desert, or life as prisoners in a world unimaginably distant from everything they had ever known. The question of what happened to these survivors would echo through history, spawning legends and theories that persist to this day. Did they die in Parthian prisons, forgotten casualties of a doomed invasion? Were they sold into slavery in the markets of Central Asia, their identities lost among the countless anonymous victims of ancient warfare? Or did something far more extraordinary occur? Did some of them somehow establish new lives in the remote corners of the known world, carrying Roman blood and Roman memories to places where neither had ever existed before? As the sun set on the battlefield of Carrhae, painting the sky the color of blood and gold, these questions remained unanswered. The immediate drama was clear enough. Rome had suffered one of its most devastating defeats, losing not only an army, but also one of its most prominent citizens. The political implications would reverberate through the Republic for years to come, contributing to the collapse of the triumvirate and the eventual rise of Caesar. But the human story, the fate of thousands of individual soldiers who had marched eastward with dreams of conquest, and found themselves facing choices that would determine not only their own survival, but possibly the course of their descendants' lives. That story was just beginning. In the peculiar silence that follows great battles, when the clash of weapons has faded and even the cries of the wounded have grown still, there exists a moment when the full magnitude of what has occurred begins to settle into the consciousness of survivors. For those Romans who lived through that terrible day at Carrhae, this moment brought not relief, but a new kind of terror, the realization that their ordeal was far from over. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a scene that would have challenged the imagination of the most creative Roman poet. Scattered across the desert plain lay the debris of what had once been one of Rome's most formidable armies. Broken weapons glinting in the fading light, abandoned standards that had once inspired pride now trampled into the dust, and everywhere the silent forms of men who had marched eastward with such high hopes only days before. Yet among this devastation moved figures that testified to the complexity of ancient warfare. Parthian soldiers picked their way carefully through the battlefield, not in the systematic looting that might be expected, but in what appeared to be a deliberate search for specific individuals. These were not mere scavengers, but men operating under orders, looking for prisoners who might serve purposes more sophisticated than simple revenge. The Parthian approach to victory was as different from Roman methods as their approach to battle had been. Where Romans typically celebrated triumph through the systematic destruction of their enemies, Parthian culture recognized the potential value of skilled survivors. A captured Roman soldier represented not just a defeated enemy, but a possible source of technical knowledge, military expertise, or diplomatic leverage. For the surviving Romans, the hours following their defeat brought a series of experiences that challenged every assumption they had held about their own identity and worth. Men who had awakened that morning as citizens of the world's greatest power found themselves reduced to the status of valuable commodities, their lives preserved not from mercy, but from calculation. The process of sorting prisoners began immediately and continued with methodical efficiency. Parthian officers, many of whom spoke enough Latin to conduct basic interrogations, moved among the captives, identifying those whose skills or knowledge might prove useful. Engineers who understood Roman siege techniques, cavalry officers familiar with Western military doctrine, and administrators experienced in provincial governance were separated from the common soldiers and given treatment that, while hardly luxurious, at least suggested they had value beyond their mere bodies. For Marcus Crassus himself, capture brought a different kind of ordeal. The man who had dreamed of Eastern conquest found himself face to face with Surina, the young Parthian general whose tactical brilliance had destroyed Roman hopes in a single day. The meeting between victor and vanquished was conducted with the formal courtesy that Persian culture demanded, but underlying the diplomatic pleasantries was a current of triumph that must have been almost unbearable for the defeated Roman. According to the accounts that would later reach Roman historians, Crassus's final hours were marked by a cruel irony that reflected Parthian understanding of Roman psychology. Surina, aware of his prisoner's legendary greed, reportedly had molten gold poured down Crassus's throat while observing that now, at last, the Roman could satisfy his famous thirst for wealth. Whether this account is literally true or merely symbolic, it captures the contempt with which Eastern minds viewed Roman materialism. But while the fate of Crassus himself has been preserved in historical accounts, the stories of his surviving soldiers remained largely untold for 20 centuries. These men, numbered in the thousands according to some sources, faced a future that would test their endurance in ways no Roman military training had prepared them for. They were about to become participants in one of history's most extraordinary experiments in cultural survival. The Parthian Empire, despite its military brilliance, was fundamentally different from Rome in its approach to organizing conquered populations. Where Romans sought to impose uniform laws and customs across their territories, Parthians governed through a loose federation of local rulers who maintained considerable autonomy as long as they remained loyal to the central authority. This system created opportunities for absorption and adaptation that simply didn't exist within the more rigid structures of Roman administration. For Roman prisoners with valuable skills, integration into Parthian society offered possibilities that would have been unthinkable in reverse circumstances. Engineers could find employment in construction projects, administrators could serve in provincial governments, and soldiers could join Parthian military units, where their expertise with Western tactical methods might prove valuable. The process was gradual and often difficult, but it represented a path toward new lives rather than mere survival. Yet even as some prisoners began the slow process of adaptation to Eastern ways, others nursed dreams of return that would never be fulfilled. The distance between Mesopotamia and Rome was measured not just in miles, but in cultural assumptions, religious beliefs, and social structures that made the idea of going home increasingly meaningless as years passed and memories faded. It was during this period of uncertain transition that the most intriguing chapter of our story began to develop. Historical sources speak of Roman prisoners being moved eastward from the immediate vicinity of the battlefield, transported deeper into the Parthian Empire, where their potential for causing trouble would be minimized. But the exact destinations of these transfers, and the ultimate fate of the men involved, remained matters of speculation and legend. Some accounts suggest that groups of Roman soldiers were settled in frontier regions, where their military experience could be used to defend Parthian territories against nomadic raiders from the steppes. Others indicate that skilled prisoners were taken to major cities where their technical knowledge could be applied to construction projects or industrial development. Still others hint at something far more extraordinary: the possibility that Roman captives were given to Parthian allies in regions so remote that their very existence would remain unknown to Western historians for centuries. The most tantalizing of these accounts concerns a group of prisoners who were reportedly transferred to Chinese control as part of a diplomatic exchange between the Parthian Empire and the Han Dynasty. If true, this would mean that Roman soldiers who had awakened one morning in Syria found themselves, after months or years of travel, in a land so distant from their origins that it might as well have been another world entirely. China in the 1st century BCE was experiencing its own period of expansion and consolidation under the Han Dynasty. The Chinese, like the Parthians, had learned to see value in foreign expertise and were willing to integrate useful outsiders into their own society. For Roman prisoners who possessed military skills or technical knowledge, service in the Chinese army might have represented not just survival, but opportunity. The Han dynasty's approach to military organization bore some interesting parallels to Roman methods, but with important differences that would have required significant adaptation on the part of Western soldiers. Chinese armies emphasized discipline and coordination, qualities that Romans would have found familiar, but they also relied heavily on mobility and flexibility in ways that might have appealed to men who had experienced the limitations of rigid tactical doctrine at Carrhae. More intriguingly, Chinese military units were often recruited from diverse ethnic backgrounds, with different groups contributing their specialized skills to the overall effectiveness of the army. Steppe nomads provided cavalry expertise, mountain peoples offered knowledge of guerrilla warfare, and settled populations supplied the disciplined infantry that formed the backbone of Chinese military power. Into this multicultural military environment, Roman prisoners, with their unique combination of tactical training and engineering skills, might have fitted more easily than into the more ethnically homogeneous Parthian forces. The process of integration would have required not just adaptation to new military methods, but acceptance of entirely different cultural assumptions about loyalty, authority, and identity. Chinese concepts of service to the state were built on philosophical foundations that would have been foreign to Roman minds, while Chinese social structures emphasized collective responsibility in ways that challenged Roman notions of individual achievement. Yet for men who had lost everything they had once valued, their country, their families, their very names, the opportunity to build new identities within an alien but functional society might have seemed preferable to the alternatives. The choice was not between their old lives and new ones, but between new lives and no lives at all. Archaeological evidence suggests that Chinese frontier regions during this period were indeed characterized by remarkable ethnic diversity. Excavations in Central Asia have revealed communities where Chinese, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian cultural elements coexisted and blended in ways that created entirely new hybrid societies. Into such communities, Roman ex-soldiers might have disappeared not through death or extinction, but through a process of cultural absorption that was so complete it left few traces for later historians to discover. The possibility becomes even more intriguing when we consider the specific military needs of Chinese frontier defense during this period. The Han dynasty was engaged in extensive campaigns against nomadic peoples along its northern and western borders, conflicts that required exactly the kind of disciplined infantry tactics in which Roman soldiers excelled. For Chinese commanders facing the challenge of creating effective combined arms formations, the addition of Western soldiers trained in Mediterranean military methods might have provided crucial tactical advantages. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this historical puzzle concerns not the immediate fate of Roman prisoners, but the long-term implications of their presence in distant lands. If Roman soldiers did indeed find new lives in Central Asia or China, they would have carried with them not just military skills, but genetic heritage that could have persisted for generations. The implications of such persistence touch on questions that extend far beyond military history into the realms of anthropology, genetics, and cultural evolution. Roman soldiers who established families in distant lands would have passed on physical characteristics, cultural memories, and perhaps even linguistic elements that might have survived in attenuated form for centuries. In recent decades, these speculative possibilities have been given new life by archaeological discoveries and genetic studies that suggest the historical reality of long-distance cultural contact may have been far more extensive than traditional scholarship assumed. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes connecting East and West, was not just a conduit for goods, but a highway for human migration, cultural exchange, and genetic mixing that created patterns of diversity whose full implications we are only beginning to understand. As night fell over the desert battlefield where so many Roman dreams had died, the survivors faced choices that would determine not only their own fates, but possibly the destinies of descendants they could not yet imagine. Some would die in captivity, their stories ending in unmarked graves far from the Mediterranean lands of their birth. Others would adapt and survive, creating new identities in societies that offered different definitions of belonging and worth. But a few, perhaps a very few, might have embarked on journeys that would carry them beyond the edges of the known world, into lands where their presence would become the stuff of legend and their descendants the subject of mystery. The golden arrows of Carrhae had not just ended Roman lives. They had launched Roman souls on trajectories that might have carried them further from home than any Roman had ever dreamed possible. In the remote mountains of Gansu province, where the ancient Silk Road once carried merchants and armies between the empires of East and West, there exists today a village whose very name whispers of mysteries that have puzzled historians for generations. Liqian, as it is known in modern Chinese, sits in a landscape that seems designed by nature to harbor secrets. High valleys where morning mist clings to ancient stone walls, terraced fields that climb toward peaks where snow lingers even in summer, and streams that carry water from sources so distant they might as well be mythical. For most of its existence, Liqian was simply another small farming community in one of China's most remote regions, remarkable only for its isolation and the industrious character of its inhabitants. But in recent decades, this obscure village has found itself at the center of one of archaeology's most intriguing debates. Could it be the final destination of those Roman legionaries who vanished from history after the disaster at Carrhae? The theory seems almost too romantic to be credible, too perfectly fitted to our desire for neat endings to history's loose threads. Yet the more closely one examines the evidence, archaeological, genetic, and cultural, the more the possibility assumes a weight that even the most skeptical scholars find difficult to dismiss entirely. The story of Liqian represents not just a potential solution to an ancient mystery, but a meditation on the ways in which human identity can persist and transform across unimaginable distances of time and space. The first hints that Liqian might harbor Roman ancestry emerged not from academic research, but from the observations of visitors who noticed something unusual about the physical appearance of some villagers. Among a population that was predominantly Chinese in appearance, there lived families whose features suggested a different heritage entirely. Blue or green eyes that caught the mountain light with startling intensity, hair that showed auburn or even blonde highlights, and facial structures that seemed to echo the portraits on Roman coins. These physical characteristics alone would not have been sufficient to support extraordinary historical claims. Central Asia has always been a crossroads where different populations mixed and intermarried, creating combinations of features that could have countless explanations. But the apparent Western characteristics of some Liqian residents became more intriguing when considered alongside other evidence that suggested cultural practices and architectural techniques with possible Mediterranean origins. The village's most distinctive feature was its defensive architecture, which bore striking resemblances to Roman military engineering. Unlike typical Chinese settlements, which were usually organized around courtyards and oriented according to feng shui principles, parts of Liqian showed evidence of grid pattern layout and fortification techniques that seemed to echo the methodical approach to defense that characterized Roman military camps. Archaeological excavations in and around the village have revealed artifacts that, while not definitively Roman, are consistent with the presence of Western military technology in this remote region during the appropriate historical period. Iron weapons showing traces of Mediterranean metallurgical techniques, fragments of armor that could have originated in Roman workshops, and most intriguingly, pieces of pottery whose decorative patterns seem to blend Roman motifs with Chinese artistic traditions. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the village's own oral traditions, which speak of ancestors who were tall, light-haired soldiers from the West, who arrived in the region centuries ago and established families with local women. These stories, passed down through generations, describe the founders of certain family lines as men who spoke a foreign language, worshipped different gods, and brought with them military skills that proved valuable to Chinese frontier defense. The oral traditions of Liqian are particularly intriguing because they include specific details that would be difficult to fabricate or borrow from general knowledge about ancient Rome. The stories speak of ancestors who arranged themselves in rectangular formations for battle, who built their houses with thick walls and small windows, and who passed down techniques for metalworking and stonework that differed from traditional Chinese methods. More remarkably, some of these oral traditions include fragments of what might be Latin words preserved in the local dialect, terms for military equipment, architectural features, and family relationships that show possible connections to Roman vocabulary. While linguistic evolution over 2 millennia makes definitive identification impossible, the patterns suggest contact with Latin-speaking peoples at some point in the village's early history. The genetic evidence, while still preliminary and subject to ongoing research, has provided some of the most intriguing support for the Roman connection theory. DNA studies of Liqian residents have identified genetic markers that are more common in European populations than in East Asian ones, suggesting admixture with Western genetic lineages at some point in the past. More specifically, mitochondrial DNA analysis has revealed maternal lineages that appear to trace back to Central Asian populations that showed signs of Western genetic influence during the period when Roman prisoners might have been moving eastward. While this evidence cannot prove direct Roman ancestry, it is consistent with the mixing of populations that would have occurred if Western men had established families with local women in Central Asian frontier regions. The Y chromosome analysis has been even more suggestive, identifying paternal lineages that show characteristics more common in Mediterranean populations than in East Asian ones. The statistical patterns suggest that Western genetic influence entered the local population at roughly the right time period, and in the right proportions to be consistent with a small group of Roman soldiers establishing families in the region. However, genetic evidence must be interpreted cautiously, as Central Asia was a region of extensive population movement and mixing throughout ancient history. The presence of Western genetic markers in Liqian could result from any number of historical migrations and does not necessarily point specifically to Roman origins. Yet when combined with the archaeological and cultural evidence, the genetic data forms part of a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to explain through coincidence alone. The historical context of Chinese frontier policy during the Han Dynasty provides a plausible framework for understanding how Roman prisoners might have ended up in such a remote location. Chinese military strategy during this period relied heavily on the integration of foreign military expertise into frontier defense systems. Prisoners of war with useful skills were often settled in border regions where their knowledge could be applied to protecting Chinese territory against nomadic raiders. For Roman soldiers with experience in disciplined infantry tactics, service in Chinese frontier armies would have offered both survival and purpose. Chinese military units were organized along lines that would have seemed familiar to Romans, with emphasis on training, discipline, and coordinated maneuvers. The technical skills that Roman engineers and craftsmen possessed would have been particularly valuable in frontier regions, where defensive works needed to be constructed quickly and efficiently. The process by which such soldiers might have transitioned from prisoners to settlers would have taken place over many years, perhaps decades. Initial service under guard would have gradually given way to trusted positions as the Romans proved their value and reliability. Marriage to local women would have created family ties that made escape both unnecessary and undesirable. Over time, what began as captivity would have evolved into a new form of belonging. The children of such unions would have grown up as cultural bridge builders, inheriting physical characteristics from their fathers, while being raised in Chinese cultural traditions by their mothers and the surrounding community. These second-generation residents would have been fully Chinese in their loyalties and identities, while carrying within their genes, and perhaps their family stories, traces of distant Mediterranean origins. As generations passed, the Roman heritage would have become increasingly attenuated, preserved more in subtle cultural practices and genetic markers than in conscious memory. By the time Chinese historical records began to mention the unusual characteristics of some Lycian residents, any clear connection to Roman origins would have been buried beneath centuries of cultural evolution and adaptation. Yet something persisted. The physical features that caught the attention of modern observers, the architectural techniques that seemed to echo Roman military engineering, the oral traditions that spoke of Western ancestors, all suggest that cultural memory can survive in forms far more durable than written records or political institutions. The story of Lycian, whether or not it truly represents the final chapter in the saga of Rome's lost legion, illuminates something profound about the nature of human identity and cultural transmission. It suggests that the boundaries we draw between civilizations, the sharp lines we trace on maps between East and West, may be far more porous and permeable than we typically imagine. In the end, the mystery of the lost legion may be less important than the mystery it represents. The countless ways in which human beings have crossed apparently impossible distances, adapted to unimaginable circumstances, and found methods for preserving essential aspects of their identity, even while transforming everything else about their lives. The Roman soldiers who may or may not have found new homes in distant Chinese valleys were participating in a process that has shaped human history from its earliest beginnings. The endless migration, mixing, and cultural evolution that has carried our species from its African origins to every corner of the globe. As our journey through this ancient mystery draws toward its close, I hope you found the same gentle fascination in these stories that has sustained historians and archaeologists through decades of research. Whether in Lycian or in a dozen other places where legend and evidence intersect, the search for Rome's lost legion continues to offer us glimpses into the remarkable adaptability and endurance of human culture. If these midnight wanderings through history's shadows have brought you comfort as you settle towards sleep, remember that subscribing helps us continue exploring these quiet corners of the past where mystery and knowledge dance together in the lamplight of scholarly curiosity. The implications of the Lycian hypothesis extend far beyond the specific fate of Roman prisoners from Carrhae. If true, it would represent one of the most remarkable examples of long-distance cultural transmission in human history, demonstrating that ancient peoples were capable of journeys and adaptations that challenge our assumptions about the limits of pre-modern travel and communication. More broadly, the story serves as a reminder that history is full of loose threads, unfinished narratives, and mysteries that may never be fully resolved. The Roman legions that marched eastward with such confidence in 53 BCE believed they were writing a straightforward tale of conquest and glory. Instead, they became participants in a story so complex and far-reaching that we are still trying to understand its implications more than 2,000 years later. Archaeological work in Central Asia continues to reveal evidence of cultural contact and population movement that was far more extensive than previously imagined. The Silk Road was not just a commercial network, but a highway for human migration that carried peoples, technologies, and ideas across distances that spanned continents. In this context, the possibility that Roman soldiers might have traveled from the battlefields of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Western China seems less fantastical and more consistent with the general patterns of ancient mobility. Recent discoveries in other parts of Central Asia have revealed communities that show clear evidence of cultural mixing between Western and Eastern traditions. Greek-influenced art has been found in Buddhist monasteries. Roman coins have appeared in Chinese archaeological contexts, and genetic studies throughout the region continue to reveal patterns of admixture that speak to extensive population movement and intermarriage. The Liqian hypothesis fits naturally into this broader picture of cultural exchange and human adaptability. Whether or not the specific claims about Roman ancestry can be proven, the village represents something real and important about the ways in which human communities have formed and reformed themselves throughout history. As we consider the fate of those Roman soldiers who survived the disaster at Carrhae, we might do well to remember that their story was not unique. Throughout history, military defeats have scattered soldiers to distant lands where they have had to choose between death and adaptation. Those who chose adaptation often found that survival required not just learning new languages and customs, but accepting new definitions of home, family, and identity. The Romans who may have ended up in places like Liqian were participating in a process that has shaped human culture from its earliest beginnings. They were learning what countless migrants before and after them have learned: that identity is more flexible than we imagine, that home can be redefined, and that human beings possess remarkable capacities for creating new forms of belonging even in the most unlikely circumstances. In the quiet valleys of Gansu province, where mountain streams carry snowmelt toward distant seas and ancient walls still mark the boundaries of forgotten settlements, the mystery of Rome's lost legion continues to whisper its questions to anyone willing to listen. Whether those questions will ever receive definitive answers matters less than the fact that they continue to be asked, reminding us that history is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation between past and present, between what we know and what we dream of knowing. As sleep settles over the landscapes where these ancient dramas unfolded, carrying our consciousness toward its own distant territories of rest and renewal, we might find comfort in the thought that somewhere in the mountains of Western China, families gather around dinner tables where the light catches eyes that might once have looked out from Roman faces, where stories are told in languages that might carry echoes of Latin words, where the human capacity for survival and adaptation continues. To write new chapters in tales that began in the dust of a Mesopotamian battlefield more than 2 millennia ago. The lost legion of Rome, whether it ended in death or transformation, in Chinese villages or Parthian graveyards, reminds us that every ending is also a beginning. Every defeat contains within it the seeds of new possibilities, and every mystery solved reveals new mysteries waiting to be explored. In this ancient pattern of loss and discovery, defeat and adaptation, we might recognize something eternal about the human condition itself. Our endless capacity to find new ways of being human, even in circumstances that seem to demand the impossible.